Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So I'm going to follow on from that. We're taking several steps back to actually just ask, what are we trying to do with a tax on corporate profit? Why do we have one? What's the point? And if we can kind of identify answers to those questions, that might help us to kind of think about what a sensible tax system might look like. So apologies, but I'm going to go right back to the beginning and say, what do we think we're doing? Start with some aims and objectives. Now, here's 4 aims and objectives which nobody could possibly argue with, because every time anybody writes down aims and objectives, they look something like this. When I say susceptibility, what I really mean is robustness to, rather than susceptibility. So maybe that wasn't best worded, but I think you know what I mean. These are kind of the kind of lists which everybody would write down. I think there's not much to be said about the first one in the kind of current context. We've debated avoidance and evasion at length in various different fora. The issue of economic efficiency is one to which Michael referred. Economists have done lots of empirical work trying to understand the extent to which corporation taxes affect business behaviour, and thence what the impact there is for actual general welfare and GDP, if you like. So I think Michael referred to some work at the OECD. The OECD did some work. Chris Heddy, who did that work, is here. So we can ask him if anybody has any questions. But as I recall, they were comparing corporation tax with other taxes, looking for the effects of distortions, trying to figure out which taxes actually created the worst distortions and hence the worst costs. And corporation tax came out worst. And it's not surprising, why that would be the case, because corporation tax is, more or less a tax on where companies do business, so it affects location choice, it affects the scale of investment, it affects the choice of legal form, it affects the sources of finance which companies use, it affects the way that companies use their profit in different ways. On all of these things, there's been lots of economic research. In all of those, we found very significant effects of taxation. In some work that I did recently with Li Liu, who's also here somewhere, we actually tried to quantify the effects of corporation tax distortion. Admittedly, in a kind of relatively small setting, but what we found was, our estimate was that for every £1 collected in corporation tax, there could be up to another 29 pence of cost to the economy, to the companies, to the exchequer, to the society at large, in terms of those economic costs. So I think when we talk about economic efficiency, these are real things, these are real costs. We don't easily observe them. The general public doesn't easily observe them and say, what are we doing about this? But they're there. Fairness is very difficult to figure out in the context of corporation tax. And as Michael said, I think the popular view would be that, well, actually, it's not quite clear what the popular view is. One popular view might be that corporation tax is largely borne by the owners. The owners tend to be better off, so it's kind of helpful for a progressive tax system. I think probably an even more popular view just kind of associates companies with the chief executives and the boards who are seen to be kind of well off. And I think that's also a popular view, and that's another justification. And if we actually dig down and try and understand who is actually worse off, then it gets much more complicated. And again, there's been lots of economic research on that, and I think it's fair to say it's unresolved. It probably falls to some extent on shareholders, to some extent on the workforce or on consumers. So fairness, I think, is much more difficult to use as a guiding principle for how we should design corporation tax. There are also issues in fairness in thinking about across countries. In my view, that really doesn't get us that far either. We can certainly kind of think about the kind of relative income levels of different countries and think about what we might do about that. The extent to which we should use corporation tax as a vehicle for, or a method for actually kind of changing and kind of making more equal those levels of income is much more difficult. Ease of administration, I think that's relatively straightforward. I don't think anybody's going to question that. Of course, we have the problem of global versus national perspectives. When we kind of sit in a room thinking globally, you think, what's best in terms of, the global welfare. But naturally, governments may be thinking more in terms of national welfare, and those two things may well differ in many respects, and especially when we're thinking about competition between countries. So that's the kind of starting point. But then let's go back and say, okay, well, given those thoughts about, what we might like a tax system to look like, what's the point of corporation tax? Why do we tax business? And business is not a person. The income certainly belongs to somebody, and the starting point would probably be to say, well, what we're really trying to do is to tax we're trying to tax the worldwide income of individuals. So if we think in the UK, we're trying to tax the worldwide income of me, other British people who are living here, and that includes capital income. Some of that capital income might be tied up in business and not distributed to the shareholders. So undistributed profits in UK companies, that might be something that HMRC could tax as a proxy for taxing me on my personal income. Well, that's fine so long as there's a closed economy and I'm not allowed to buy shares in any foreign companies. But if I buy shares in a company in Venezuela, then HMRC is going to find it a bit more difficult to tax the income that is owned by me, but is actually in this Venezuelan company, which is a non-listed private company in Venezuela, which in general doesn't supply any information to HMRC. So it's as a proxy for the worldwide tax on kind of individuals, it doesn't seem to me that it gets us very far. And in this connection, I don't have the slide that I was going to show you. In this connection, there's a very interesting slide which I was going to show you, but which is not in this. But I will recommend to you, there's some work done by Steve Rosenberg in the Tax Policy Center in the US, looking at the ownership of US companies. And he shows that if we go back to 1965, then 85% of the shares of US companies were actually owned by US taxpayers. And in that context, it makes sense to think about US companies, taxing US companies as a proxy for taxing US shareholders. Coming up to the present day, what they find is very, very roughly about a third of US shares are owned by foreign individuals and institutions. About another third are owned by tax-exempt institutions in the US. And a final third, roughly, it's actually slightly under 30%, is actually owned by US tax-paying individuals. So taking that, I don't have numbers for the UK. I would imagine that the numbers of the UK would be at least as dramatic. But using that, thinking that what we're doing with a corporation tax as a proxy for personal income tax, when actually less than 30% of shareholders are actually paying tax on that income anyway, doesn't seem like a very good starting point for corporation tax. And it's not very good proxy when we think of what existing corporation taxes are. If we take the OECD model, what we're trying to do apparently is to broadly tax profit where economic activity takes place. That's just something different from a proxy for where individuals are earning worldwide income. So let's go on to that. Is it a good idea to have a corporation tax effectively as a kind of fee for the use of publicly provided goods and services where economic activity takes place? Now, that may be a kind of reasonable approach. Now, it's certainly the case that businesses here are using publicly provided goods and services. Maybe they should make a contribution to that. That would certainly seem a reasonable case. I think the issue there is the value and cost associated with the use of those publicly provided goods and services, is that actually related to the amount of profit that the companies are making? We can think of very large companies making phenomenal use of publicly provided goods and services, but actually are rather unprofitable and not paying any tax. We could think of smaller companies making rather little use of that, actually making higher levels of profit. If actually what we want to do is a payment for publicly provided goods and services, then perhaps we should actually do that and actually have something more like a user fee, depending on actually what companies are doing. And maybe perhaps that would be a lot easier to implement. We could identify, how many buildings have you got, how big are they, how many lorries do you have driving up and down motorways, how many people do you employ. We can tax those things, and actually most of those are relatively easily observable, unlike the amount of profit that you make in the UK. Okay, there are lots of other things, lots of other reasons we could come up with. I've kind of listed those, and I don't want to go into them in any detail because I don't want to take up time. Taxing foreigners, that would be great if we could do it. I think it's probably harder than we think. Actually, we might think that taxing a US multinational here is actually taxing Americans. But actually, economic theory and economic evidence suggests it's not quite that easy, and much of that tax will be passed on. The political point, I think the point that Michael meant, certainly if you talk to politicians, they like corporation tax because it's not a tax that people think they're paying. We can collect revenue by taxing somebody else, and therefore have lower taxes on individuals. If we're just looking at this from a political point of view, then, okay, we could take that seriously. From an economic point of view, obviously that doesn't really make much sense. There are tax capitalization issues. We have a tax on corporations. Suppose we just abolish tax altogether. We might recover some of the loss in share values over the last weekend because taxes will be that much lower. So the fact that we have one, if we don't want to just kind of give a one-off boost to existing shareholders, we might want to think carefully about how we implement any changes to corporation tax. There are issues, and these issues are true both in the UK and developed countries, but also in even more so in lower income countries, that actually it's easier to tax businesses than it's to tax individuals because businesses tend to have the formal requirements. They have accounts, they know how much money they've made, at least to some extent in lower income countries. So the administration costs of taxing them are much lower. And of course we see that in the UK. If you look at the kind of PwC publications, it turns out that most tax in the UK is actually collected by business. It's not just corporation tax, it's PAYE, it's VAT, it's all the other taxes that are raised in the UK. But again, that's a pretty good reason for using businesses as an unpaid tax collector. It's not particularly a good argument for taxing profits because all those other taxes are actually on different bases. I think there is one, in low-income countries in particular, it may be very difficult for low-income countries to tax, to find other tax bases. In those countries, actually taxing businesses is probably even more important than it is in countries like the UK. Again, though, we can think about whether the appropriate base in those countries will be profit or something which is more easily observable. Okay, so those are lots of reasons why we might go back to first principles and say, well, actually, do we need to tax corporate profit at all? Is it actually doing any use? If we want to tax rich people and have a progressive tax system, then why don't we think of a way of taxing rich people under a personal income tax or wealth tax or inheritance tax, all of those different ways, rather than a somewhat indirect possible way that is more progressive. Okay, so being a bit more positive, so if we are going to have a tax, let's think first in terms of economic efficiency. What would an efficient tax look like? Well, I think a starting point, which we're thinking internationally, is what can we tax which isn't going to move as soon as we try and tax it. If we try and tax profit, which can be shifted to lower tax jurisdictions, then that's relatively easy to move, perhaps. But also, real activity is also easy to move, and Michael was talking about that. We're now going to shift loads of people into tax havens because that's where the OECD thinks profit is made. It's made by the person who's controlling risk, for example. So if we want actually an efficient tax, we want to prevent that. We want to kind of tax something, which is not going to easily move. So we can think of different cases like that. An obvious one is natural resources. So, actually a tax on natural resources is a very natural thing to think about. It's not entirely immobile in the sense to which, companies developing and extracting those natural resources may go to one country before going to another country, so they may still making location decisions, but it's certainly a lot more immobile than many other things. It's quite hard to apply a general tax on sources of economic rent which are kind of location specific. Natural resources are a kind of obvious case. There may be many other cases. There may be cases, we may think up to a point the City of London, generates higher profits because all of those kind of financial companies are together in the City of London, at least for the time being. But it's actually hard to kind of think of a general corporation tax which is going to capture those location-specific economic profits, but not to capture things which are not location-specific. So that kind of leads us to thinking, okay, well, what is relatively immobile? And when we think of a multinational company, has lots of different activities in lots of different places, all of which it can move around. So the things, thinking about that, things which are relatively immobile, it seems to me that things are kind of either end, the kind of people who actually transact with the multinational company. At the one hand, we have shareholders, who are people who are relatively immobile. At the other end, we have consumers who ultimately are people and are relatively immobile. So I think that points us to thinking about, is it possible to tax profit either in the place of the shareholder or the place of consumers? I've said something about shareholders already. It seems to me we haven't really come up with a way that we could think of as actually kind of allocating the profits of a company to shareholders. Allocating it to the kind of headquarters of the company is not quite the same. What I mean here is actually allocating all the way down to the shareholders. So let's leave that to one side for a moment and just think about taxing profit in the location of consumers. It's clearly very different from what we have at the moment. We could argue that the place of sale is actually the source of profit. If you don't make a sale, you're not going to make any profit. Ultimately, you have to make a sale if you're going to make any profit at all. So it's certainly one place in which it's a kind of necessary condition, if you like, to make a profit that you actually get some income. It's clearly not sufficient, though. There are clearly lots of other places which a multinational is doing activities other than the place of sale. All of those might be thought to be some kind of part of the source. If we do try and tax in the place where consumers are, that's clearly quite different. It's not a tax. We couldn't pretend that it's anything to do with a tax on the personal income of the shareholders. It's not particularly a place where it's not a place as a kind of user fee for publicly provided goods and services where the economic activity takes place, because that may be somewhere else. So it's not really addressing either of those issues. So if you think these are the kind of key features which we're trying to address, then a tax on the place of consumption is not the right way to go. Our arguments and some of the things we're going to show in the proposal later on today is basically we think it is possible to improve economic efficiency, because that's a kind of a less immobile, it's a more immobile place for taxing. And it also helps on those other things I had on my first slide, robustness to avoidance and cost of collection. So this is a kind of theme, if you like, of kind of where our thoughts have been driving us and what we're thinking about in terms of kind of how we could reform international tax. I just have two things to finish off with. When we think about the scope of tax reform, we can attack that in at kind of various different levels. As an economist, I like to say, okay, well, let's kind of just sit down with a clean sheet of paper and think, what would an ideal tax system look like? Let's kind of figure out what that is, and then the next step would be say, how can we get from where we are now to where we would like to be? So that's one approach. Another approach would be to say, okay, well, here's where we are. How can we make it better? Could we kind of change this rule or that rule in a way to make it better? And I guess the OECD BEPS project is very much along the latter. I think there's a kind of difference. I mean, I think what we've done in our tax group is really to think of both of these and try and kind of integrate them to some extent. And this is really why we have two proposals in the end. Neither of these is better than the other in a way. They're both different ways of looking at it. I think if we are making incremental improvements, at least we should be, having some kind of broader view of what we think, the tax system should look like in the longer run. Even if we're not going to kind of get all the way there in one go, at least it would be nice to think that, the improvements that we are making or the reforms that we're making are at least consistent with some kind of bigger picture. And one point I would make, and, I'd advocate this in the debates we have today, is that, a lot of debate about tax reform seems to me to, have two people arguing with each other, but actually they're using kind of different assumptions or they're starting from different places. It's easy to think, okay, well, I'm going to make a proposal for a tax reform, but of course, for example, we have to keep interest deductibility because that's a key part of the existing system. So therefore, when we're thinking about tax reform, it's got to be something which incorporates that. They're talking to somebody who thinks, no, we could get rid of interest deductibility. There's so many elements of the tax system. We have to be a bit more explicit when we're thinking about it as, what are we thinking? What are we willing to overturn? Are we willing to kind of rethink tax treaties? Are we willing to go back and kind of argue about what the WTO rules say? There's all kinds of elements of that. I don't think anything should be off limits, but what I do think is that we should be kind of as explicit as possible in what it is that we're talking about that needs to be reformed. And finally, there's an issue of stability and this term incentive compatibility, which economists like to talk about a lot. A problem with the existing system is that we have tax competition. And why do we have tax competition? Because if we reduce our tax rate, then we believe we may get more inward investment. And some of that is going to be at the expense of another country. Investment is going to move from place to place. So all the kind of pressure in the international tax system really is to kind of undermine it. The UK is a pretty prime example of that over the last few years. You may or may not agree with a kind of lower tax rate, but clearly the aim of that lower tax rate is to kind of attract investment, which would otherwise, at least some of which would have taken place elsewhere, and therefore is it kind of imposing, costs on other countries. A stable tax system would be one in which that's not true, in which there would be no incentive to undermine it and to impose those costs on other countries. Let me give one example. Somewhat ironically, I think, we have rules in the EU, as long as we remain in it, about VAT and VAT rates, but there's no pressure on VAT rates. There's no competition in VAT rates. And why isn't there competition in VAT rates? It's because VAT is actually levied in the place where the consumer is. It doesn't matter that much to our European colleagues, what the VAT rate in the UK is. It does matter what the corporation tax rate is. So I think we need to think about that in the context of thinking about tax reform, and this is also important in the context of whether we need to kind of have collaboration in introducing tax reform, or whether we can do this kind of country by country. But I will leave more discussion on that to later in the day. Thank you.